The Duke of Renmore did not look up from the fire when she came in, and when she had finished saying the thing she had walked 4 miles in the rain to say, he said it to the 2 gentlemen at his elbow rather than to her. "Leave the accounts to my men of business," and the taller of the 2 gentlemen smiled the small, closed smile of a man agreeing with money. And Verity Ashcombe went on standing in the middle of the great cold library with her father's reckoning book held flat against her chest until the smiling had finished with her, and there was nothing left in the room to say. Then she made her curtsy to the back of a duke's head, and she went out, past the footman who would not meet her eye, into the rain that had not troubled to stop. The library at Renmore smelled of damp stone and lamp oil and the Swedish rot of books that a great house has stopped opening. It was the 4th week of March in the year 1816, and the park outside the tall windows was a brown ruin of standing water, the ha-ha drowned, and the home meadows under a skin of flood. And somewhere out in that wet the 12th Duke of Renmore's grand and rotten inheritance was quietly going down at 5%. Mr. Anselm Frayne, the Duke's man of business, stood by the mantel where the warmth was, and he had not smiled, quite. He had done something more careful than smiling. He had waited to be sure the Duke would say it, and then he had let his face agree. 6 months later, on the 29th of September, at Michaelmas, that same Duke would stand in his own emptied strong room with a candle in his hand and beg her to tell him a 4th time how she had done it, because he could not make himself believe it even with the papers on the table in front of him. And she would tell him, plainly, in order, the way her father had taught her to read a thing back twice, always twice, because a sum cast up once is only a guess with ink on it. But that was Michaelmas, and this was Lady Day week. And in Lady Day week the library was full of the Duke's certainty and the man of business's patience, and Verity Ashcombe was the only person within 11 miles who could have told either of them that the house was being robbed, and had just been shown the door for trying. She was 24. She had grown up not half a mile from where she had just been humiliated, in the Plain Square agent's house on the edge of the Renmore Park, because her father, Thomas Ashcombe, had been land agent to the 11th Duke for 31 years, and before that under agent to the 10th. And Thomas Ashcombe had kept the estate's rents and its repairs and its timber fellings and its every shilling in a fair round hand in a set of long calf-bound ledgers that he had taught his daughter to rule and cast and prove before she was 12 years old. He had no son. He had said more than once that it was no matter, because Verity could carry a column of figures in her head down 3 flights of stairs without dropping a farthing of it, which was more than he could say for any clerk he had ever hired, and he had meant it for praise and she had taken it for love, which between the Ashcombes came to the same thing. He had died of a pleurisy the autumn the old Duke died, the 2 of them inside a month of each other, and that was how it happened that a great estate and a great debt changed hands in the same Black Quarter, and how Mr. Anselm Frayne came down from London to be the new Duke's man of business and found, waiting in the agent's house, a young woman who knew where every body was buried on the estate because her father had helped bury most of them honestly. Frayne had kept her on for exactly 11 weeks, long enough to have her copy the rent rolls fair for him and explain the tenancies and walk him over the farms. And then, in the new year, he had told her, very civilly, that His Grace's affairs were now to be managed on a modern system from the London office, that a lady's assistance, however dutiful, was no longer required, and that she might keep her father's private memorandum books as a remembrance, the estate having no further use for them. She had thought at the time that it was unkind. She understood now that it was the single most careless thing Anselm Frayne ever did, because the books he let her keep as a sentimental remembrance were the honest record of 31 years. And the books he kept for himself were the lie, and a lie is only safe as long as nobody is holding the truth it was copied from. What had happened, and what it had taken her the better part of a year of quiet arithmetic at other men's tables to be sure of, was this. Renmore carried a mortgage. Most great estates did. There was no shame in a bond. A landed man borrowed against his acres the way a farmer borrowed against his harvest, and the 11th Duke had borrowed £12,000 years back against the home farm and the great oak woods and the mill at 5% from a county banking house, and had paid the interest faithfully every quarter day of his life and thought no more of it than a man thinks of his own rent. £12,000 was a great sum, and not a killing one. The Renmore rents were near $4,000 a year, and out of $4,000 a year, a careful man pays $600 in interest and hardly feels it. That was the estate her father had kept. That was the estate that should have passed to the young Duke, burdened, yes, but breathing. An estate that a sober decade would have cleared. What the young Duke had actually been handed by the man who came down from London to manage his affairs on a modern system was something else entirely, and the difference between the two was Anselm Frayne, and the whole of it was in the gap between two sets of figures. Because Frayne collected the rents, the real rents, the full rents, from tenants who paid on the nail, because Renmore tenants had always paid on the nail, and he credited the estate, in the books the Duke saw, with something less. Not wildly less. A shrewd thief is never greedy in any one place, he is greedy in 100 small places at once. A farm let at £90 went into the Duke's book at 75, the 15 went into Frayne's pocket. A cottage row that paid was written down as 3 parts empty. A fall of timber worth £400 was sold, and 200 was accounted, and the woods came down just the same. And every quarter the books the Duke was shown said the same sorrowful thing in a fair clerkly hand, that the rents were falling, that the tenants were poor, that the times were hard since the peace, that the estate did not make its interest and must borrow to meet it. And every quarter the young Duke, who had been a soldier and not a scholar, who had come home from the wars to a father's grave and a mountain of paper and a man of business who spoke figures at him with grave and gentle confidence, believed it, and signed where he was told to sign. And what he had been signing, quarter by quarter, was fresh borrowing. Frayne had let the honest single mortgage grow. He had renewed it larger. He had added a second bond and a third. He had, verity was all but certain, arranged that some of the new money the Duke borrowed to pay the interest was money Frayne himself now stood behind, through the county bank where Frayne's own brother-in-law sat as a partner, so that the Duke was, without knowing it, borrowing his own stolen rents back again and paying interest on them to the man who had stolen them. The £12,000 her father had known was now something past 20. And the whole ingenious rotten structure of it stood or fell on one date, because Frayne, patient as a spider, had not built it to bleed the estate forever. He had built it to take the estate. The largest of the bonds, the one that swallowed all the others, fell due for renewal or redemption at Michaelmas, the 29th of September, and it was secured on the entailed heart of Renmore, the home farm and the mill and the great oak woods that no Duke was supposed to be able to sell or lose, and the terms of it, which the Duke had signed without reading because his man of business had told him it was a formality, gave the mortgagee the right, if the sum were not found on the day, to enter and to foreclose. And the mortgagee, behind 2 lawyers and a shell of a county bank, was Anselm Frayne. He had spent 2 years persuading a Duke to sign away his own house to him one honest-looking quarter day at a time, and he had 6 months left to run, and the only person in the county who could read the 2 sets of books side by side and see the theft standing up in them like a man was a land agent's daughter he had dismissed for a remembrance. She had not gone to the Duke first. She wanted the record to show, ever after, that she had not gone to the Duke first, because she had known how it would look, the discarded agent's girl, come with a grievance and a story against the fashionable London man who had turned her out of her place. So she had spent the winter making certain. She had her father's ledgers, 31 years of them, the true rents in his own round hand. She had, because a market town runs on the same few clerks, copied in her own time and at her own cost the corn factor's receipts, and the timber merchant's book, and the tithe accounts, and the parish poor rate assessments, every outside paper that touched a Renmore rent, every place where the world had written down what a Renmore tenant had actually paid or sold or been charged, and she had laid them all against the figures Frayne published to his master, and where the two disagreed she had marked it, and totted it, and proved it twice. By Lady Day she had a second book of her own making, a plain gray quarto, and in it, cast up in a column that ran down 3 pages, was the exact sum Anselm Frayne had taken out of Renmore in 2 years and 1 quarter, 9,400 and some odd pounds, and the exact means by which he meant to turn a stolen 9,000 into a whole estate at Michaelmas. And then, and only then, holding a thing she could prove, she had put on her cloak and walked 4 miles in the rain to tell the Duke of Renmore that he was being robbed. And the Duke of Renmore, who had a soldier's contempt for figures and a grief-worn trust in the one man who seemed to carry them for him, had told her to leave the accounts to his men of business. It is worth stopping on that, because it is the hinge of everything, and because it is the commonest thing in the world. He was not a stupid man, and he was not a cruel one. He was a tired man of 31 who had buried a father he had quarreled with and come home to a ruin he did not understand, and Anselm Frayne had spent 2 years being the one calm, competent voice in the wreck. The man who knew, the man who managed, the man who said, "Do not trouble yourself. Your Grace, leave it with me." And now here was a young woman he half remembered as the old agent's girl, standing in his library with a shabby book against her chest, telling him that the calm, competent voice was a thief and the whole shape of his world was a lie. Of course he did not believe her. Believing her would have cost him the one solid thing he thought he was standing on. It is very much easier, when a stranger tells you the floor is rotten, to send the stranger away than to jump. So he sent her away. And Mr. Anselm Frayne, by the mantel, watching the agent's daughter make her curtsy to the back of the Duke's head, understood 2 things in that moment that the Duke did not. He understood exactly what was in the gray book she carried out under her arm, and he understood that he had 6 months to get it away from her, or burn it, or make so sure of her that no one would ever believe a word she cast up, and that the pleasant part of his work at Renmore was over. She walked home in the rain along the drowned lane under the dripping limes, and she did not cry, because she had done her crying in the winter over the arithmetic, when a column had come out wrong 3 times and then come out right, and she had understood, sitting alone at her father's desk with his pen in her hand, exactly what the rightness meant and how alone she was going to be in the knowing of it. The agent's house stood where the park gave out onto the road, a plain, honest square of brick with a stone step her father had worn hollow, and it was hers now only on sufferance. For the estate owned it, and the estate was Frayne's to speak for, and she had understood that too, walking home, that the roof over her head belonged, in law, to the man she was setting out to destroy. She lit her own fire and dried her own hands and got down the ledgers, all of them, the 31 honest years and the one gray book of her own. And she laid them on the long deal table her father had cast the rents at. And she did not open them to work, not that night. She only sat with her hand flat on the top of the pile, the way another woman might have laid a hand on a grave. And she said aloud to the empty room and to the man who had taught her every figure in it, "Well, Father, he wouldn't hear it. So now we do it the long way." Thomas Ashcombe had told her the long way, once, without knowing he was telling her anything she would need. She had been perhaps 15, and a tenant had sworn blind he had paid a rent he had not paid, and had a manner and a loud voice and the sympathy of the tap room, and her father had said nothing to the man's face at all. He had gone home and got his book and copied out the entry and the date and the 2 witnesses and taken it quietly to the steward. And the loud man had gone silent, and afterward her father had said to her, "A shouting match you can lose, Verity, and a shouting match against your betters you will always lose. But a book does not shout, and it does not tire, and it does not care whose son you are. And if you keep it honest and keep it long, it will still be telling the truth in the morning after every clever man in the room has gone home to bed. Keep the book." The book is how the small win. She had been 24 for a fortnight, and she had a book that did not shout, and she had until the 29th of September, and she had a duke who would not hear her, and a thief who now knew she could, and she had, when she counted them honestly, exactly no allies in the world. So she started, that wet March night, to do the only thing she knew how to do, which was to make the book so complete and so plain and so impossible to argue with that a day would come when it would have to be read whether the clever men wished it or not. She would need, she thought, a way in, some door into Renmore that Frayne did not hold the key to. She did not yet know what it was, but she knew. The way she knew a column was wrong before she found the error. That the door existed, because Anselm Frayne was clever and thorough and patient, and clever, thorough, patient men make exactly one kind of mistake. They leave the honest thing lying about, because it never once occurs to them that the honest thing is dangerous. He had let her keep her father's books for a remembrance. Somewhere at Renmore there would be another such door, left carelessly open by a man too sure of himself to lock it, and she meant to find it before Michaelmas. The door, when she found it, was an old woman. There was a dowager at Renmore, the young duke's great aunt, the Lady Sophronia Vane, who had been born in the house before the American War and had never in 80 years seen a reason to leave it, and who lived now in the East Wing, with a companion and a parrot and a settled contempt for nearly everything that had happened since 1790. Verity's father had liked her. He had been almost the only man on the estate the old lady would receive, because he came with figures, and she had a head for figures, the way some old women have a head for scandal. And Thomas Ashcombe had gone up to the East Wing every quarter for 30 years to read the old duke's aunt the state of the rents, not because he was obliged to, but because she asked, and because a woman who has outlived her whole century likes to be told that the money is real. When Thomas Ashcombe died, the visits had stopped, and the Lady Sophronia had marked their stopping, and had thought her own thoughts about a modern man of business who never once came up to the East Wing to tell an old woman the truth about her own family's land. So when a note came down to the agent's house in April, in a spidery hand 80 years old, requesting that Miss Ashcombe wait upon Lady Sophronia Vane at her earliest convenience, and bring her father's books, Verity understood that the door had opened itself, and she put on her good gray gown and went. The old lady received her in a room that had not changed a chair since the coronation of the third George, upright in black silk with a cap of yellowed lace, and she looked at Verity for a long moment with eyes gone pale as skimmed milk but nothing wrong behind them, and she said, "You have your father's chin. He was an honest man in a trade that does not encourage it. Sit down and tell me why my great-nephew's house smells of ruin. And do not spare me, girl. I am far too old to be spared, and I have buried better men than you will ever meet." And Verity Ashcombe, who had been carrying the whole weight of it alone since the winter, sat down in a dead king's drawing-room and told an old woman of 80 the truth she had not been allowed to tell a duke of 30, plainly, in order, out of the books. And the Lady Sophronia Vane listened to the whole of it without once interrupting, and at the end she was quiet for a while, and then she said a thing Verity did not expect. "I have watched that man Frayne come up the drive for 2 years," she said, "in a coat too good for a servant and a hat too humble for a gentleman, and I have thought, that man is measuring the house. I did not know for what. Now I do. And you have brought me proof, which is more than my contempt ever was." She reached out one dry hand and laid it on the gray quarto. "My great-nephew is a fool about money and a good man about most other things, which is the most dangerous combination God makes, because it means the thieves love him and the honest despair of him. He will not hear you because you are young and a woman, and he turned you off. No, do not color, child. He did turn you off. Frayne did it in his name. It is the same thing, and he knows it, and it shames him, and shame makes men deaf. But he will hear me, because I frightened him when he was 6, and I have not stopped. And because I hold in my own name a thing that man Frayne cannot touch and does not know, I have kept." And here the old woman smiled, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of 80 years that has been waiting for a use, and she told Verity the second half of the door. The Lady Sophronia had been left, by the old duke's father, a jointure, a widow's portion settled on her for her life, charged upon the estate, a sum paid to her every quarter out of the Renmore rents. It was hers by deed, ancient and unbreakable, prior to every bond and mortgage Frayne had ever contrived, because it had been settled 2 generations before he was born. And for the paying of a jointure, the law gave the jointress a right that no man of business could deny her, the right to inspect the estate accounts, to satisfy herself that the land which owed her money was able to pay it. For 30 years she had never once used the right, because Thomas Ashcombe came up and told her the truth for nothing. She had a mind now to use it. "You cannot walk into that man's estate office and demand his books," she said. "You are nobody, forgive me. You are the agent's girl, and he will have you thrown into the road, which he may do in any case, the road being his. But I am somebody. I am the last thing in this house older than the dead, and I have a deed in a box that says I may see the accounts, and I mean to see them, and I mean to bring my own, what shall we call you, my own woman of business to help me read them, an infirm old lady's eyes being so weak, you understand, that she must have a clever young person to cast the sums for her, and that clever young person will be you. And there is not a court in England, nor a clause in any bond that thief ever forged, that can keep Sophronia Vane's own reader out of the room where Sophronia Vane's own jointure is accounted. Now when does the great bond fall due?" "Michaelmas," said Verity. "The 29th of September." "Then we have not long," said the old woman, "and you had better call me every day, and bring the books, and we shall be 2 women reading, and God help Mr. Frayne, for I certainly shan't." So that was the door, and it was a good one, and it held. But it did not hold easily, because Anselm Frayne was not a man to be surprised twice. When the formal letter went from the Lady Sophronia's attorney, she had an attorney of her own, a very old one in the county town, older even than she was, and entirely deaf to fashion, requiring the estate office to lay the accounts of the last 3 years before the jointress or her appointed reader. Frayne understood in an afternoon exactly what had happened and who the appointed reader would be, and he moved against it with a speed and a smoothness that told Verity, more than anything yet had, how much he had to lose. He did not refuse. Refusing would have been an admission. He complied, slowly, partially, with a great show of dutiful bustle, and what he laid before them, in a locked room at the great house, under the eye of a clerk who never left, were the books the Duke saw. The lie, the fair clerkly hand, the falling rents, the poor tenants, the hard times since the peace. He gave them the murdered account and dared them to find the body, and for a bad 10 days it nearly worked, because Frayne's false books were beautiful, internally perfect, every column proved, every sum true to every other sum. A closed and flawless world that could not be broken from the inside because it had been built from the inside by a clever man with all the time he wanted. Lady Sophronia's old attorney looked at them and could find no fault, because there was no fault to find. A good forgery of an account has no errors in it. That is the whole point of a good forgery. And the old lady looked at Verity across the locked room over the beautiful lying books and said, "Lo, well, child, he has given us exactly what we asked for, and it is perfect. Where is he?" And Verity Ashcombe said the thing her father had taught her without knowing he taught it. "He is not in the book, my lady," she said. "He is in the difference between the book and the world. You cannot catch him from inside his own figures, because he made them agree. You catch him by laying his figures against the ones he does not control, the corn factors, the timber merchants, the tithe, the poor rate, the tenant's own receipts, because those men wrote down the truth for their own reasons and never thought of Renmore's mortgage at all. His book says Marsh Farm paid £75. The corn factor's book says the man at Marsh Farm sold 200 pounds of barley that same year off a farm rented by every custom in the county at a fifth of its produce. 90 pounds, not 75. 15 pounds gone, in one entry, in 1 year, in one farm, and there are 40 farms and 3 years, and I have every one of them here. She laid her own grey quarto on the table beside his beautiful lie. His book is a locked room, my lady, but I have been standing outside it for a year with my ear to every other wall in the county, and I have written down what I heard. And now we lay the two together and let the room fall down. It did not fall down that day. That is the part the stories leave out. That being right, even provably right, even with the proof cast up in a fair hand in a grey book, is only the beginning, because the proof still has to be forced in front of eyes that do not want to see it. And Anselm Frayne spent the summer making very sure the eyes stayed shut. He could not get the grey book. Verity carried it on her person, or locked it, where even the old lady's attorney did not know, having learned that much caution. So he set to work on her instead, and he did it the way clever thieves always do it, not with violence, but with reputation. Because a woman's word, in the year 1816, was a cheap thing to break. Word began to go about the county town that the old Renmore agent had died leaving his affairs in disorder, that there were sums unaccounted from his own long stewardship, that the daughter had been turned off for cause and not for economy, that she was a clever, bitter, unmarried creature nursing a grievance against the respectable gentleman who had found her father's errors and let her go gently rather than prosecute. None of it was true. All of it was plausible, which is worse than true and cheaper to buy. Two tradesmen who had been civil to her all her life grew distant. The corn factor, whose own receipts were half her evidence, was visited by a pleasant stranger from the county bank and afterward found he could not quite recall giving Miss Ashcombe any papers and would rather not be named if it came to anything, having his credit to think of. A rumor reached her, through the one servant at the great house who still loved her father's memory, that Mr. Frayne had told the Duke, gravely and reluctantly, that the poor young woman was not in her right mind on the subject of the accounts, that grief for her father had unsettled her, that it was a sad case and the kindest thing was to pay her no attention, and perhaps, in Christian charity, to see her removed somewhere quiet for her own good. And that was the summer Verity Ashcombe learned what it costs to be the small person who is right. Because it does not cost you the argument. She was winning the argument. The gray book grew heavier and surer every week. It costs you the ground you stand on, one plank at a time. Until you look down one day in August and find you are standing on nothing but an 80-year-old woman's contempt and your own dead father's handwriting, and the whole respectable weight of the county is leaning, gently and regretfully and with the very best manners, on the idea that you are mad. What broke it was oak. The old lady, when Verity told her how the county wind was blowing, did not waste an hour on indignation. She sat very still in her black silk and thought, and then she said, "He is winning the whisper. We cannot unwhisper him. We have not the standing. So we must show my great-nephew a thing he can put his own hand on. Something that is not a figure at all, because Frayne has taught him to distrust figures and trust the man who reads them. What in your book is not a figure? What in your book is a thing a man can walk out of his own front door and touch?" And Verity, who had cast up the timber account so many times she saw it behind her eyes, said, "The oaks, my lady. The great oaks in the West Hanger. His book credits the estate with one fall of timber in 3 years, £200, a light thinning. But the timber merchant at Colden bought £400 of Renmore oak in that time, and I have his bills. And £400 of oak is not a thinning, it is a slaughter. There should be, if his book is honest, a few dozen stumps in the West Hanger and no more. There are, if I am right, above 200. Nobody has counted them, because nobody thinks to count what is already gone. But a man may count stumps, my lady. Even a duke may count stumps. They do not lie, and they cannot be got out of the ground before Michaelmas. So the Lady Sophronia Vane did the one thing she had not done in 11 years. She had herself carried down to the great hall in a chair, to the open astonishment of the whole household, and she sent for her great-nephew, and she did not receive him in her drawing-room where he might humor an old aunt and leave. She received him in the hall in front of the servants, where a duke must mind his manners, and she said, in a voice 80 years old and hard as a ledger's spine, "Julian, you turned off the only honest servant this house had left, because a smooth man from London told you to, and now the smooth man is telling the county the girl is mad, and you are letting him, and I will not die and leave Renmore to a fool. You will come with me tomorrow to the West Hanger, and you will bring your man of business, and you will bring the girl, and we will count the oaks. All of us, together, and then we will see who is mad. And a duke may refuse a stranger, and a duke may refuse an agent's daughter, but a duke of 31, who was frightened of this woman at 6, cannot refuse his great aunt in his own hall in front of his own footman. And he said, stiffly, that he would come, and he came. It was the first fine week of September. The flood long dried, the stubble gold, and they went up to the west hangar in a strange, grim procession. The old lady in a farm cart got up with cushions because no carriage would go up the wood ride, the Duke on his horse, Anselm Frayne on his, very smooth, very patient, saying gravely as they went what a sad necessity this was. How the poor young woman's fancies had now to be indulged before an ailing lady of 80. How he hoped her ladyship would not take a chill for a whim, and Verity Ashcombe, walking because nobody had thought to give the agent's daughter a horse, walking up the ride with her father's timber ledger under her arm and her heart going like a hammer, because she had cast the sum 100 times, but she had never actually stood in the hangar and counted. And if she were wrong, if the merchant's oak had come from some other fall, some honest source she had not found, then she was every bad thing the county said she was, and she would end her days somewhere quiet for her own good. She was not wrong. They came up over the shoulder of the hill into the west hangar, which within her own memory had been a cathedral of oak, 300 years of timber, the pride of the estate, the trees the entail itself was written to protect, and it was a graveyard. It was stumps, raw and gray and green, mossed by their age, rank on rank of them down the whole south slope, the sawn faces of the older cuts weathered silver, hundreds of them, a butchery of a wood, and the young Duke reined in at the edge of it and went perfectly white, because he had been away at the wars while it happened and had not once ridden up here since he came home to his grief and his paper. And Frayne's book had told him the hangar was well, a light thinning, 200 pounds, and here was 3 centuries of his family cut off at the knee and sold. "Count them," said the Lady Sophronia from her cushions, into a silence with nothing in it but wind. "You wanted figures, Julian. There are your figures, standing in the ground where a thief could not carry them off. My reader says there are above 200. Mr. Frayne's book says a few dozen. Get down off your horse and count them yourself, and believe your own hands if you will not believe hers." And the Duke of Renmore got down off his horse in his fine coat, and he walked into the murdered wood, and he began, God help him, to count the stumps, aloud, in a voice that got lower and worse as it went. And Verity walked 3 paces behind him, with her father's ledger open, and read him the merchant's bills as he went. This fall the March of 1815, 41 trees, and here they are. This the autumn, 60 trees, and here this the spring past, when your book says the hangar was left alone entirely. And count them, your grace. Count that stand there. And Anselm Frayne sat on his horse at the edge of the wood, and for the first time in 2 years found he had nothing smooth to say. Because you cannot manage a man who is counting his own murdered oaks with his own mouth. You cannot tell him the trees are a young woman's fancy, while he is standing among them with his hand on a sawn stump the width of a table. The Duke counted 231 before he stopped, halfway up the slope, and stood with his back to all of them for a long time. And when he turned round, his face had changed in a way that faces do not change back from. He did not look at Frayne. He looked at Verity Ashcombe, standing in the ruin of his family's wood in a dusty gray gown, with her father's book open in her 2 hands. And he said, quite quietly, "In March you stood in my library and told me my house was being robbed, and I told you to leave the accounts to my men of business, and you made your curtsy to the back of my head and went out into the rain. I have thought about the back of my own head every day since I heard my great-aunt say the word oak. I owe you an apology of a size I do not know how to make, and I find I have not time to make it. Because if a man will steal 300 years of oak, he will not stop at oak. And I think you know exactly what else he has taken. And I think you have it written down. I have it all written down, your grace, said Verity. 31 years of what the estate truly earned, in my father's hand, and 2 years of what Mr. Frayne told you it earned, in his, and the difference between them, cast up and proved twice, in mine. £9,400 and some odd, gone in 2 years and a quarter, and a bond falling due at Michaelmas that is meant to turn the theft into your whole estate. I could not make you hear it in March. I am not sure I can make you hear all of it now, but you can hear the oaks, and the oaks are only 1 page. Anselm Frayne at the edge of the wood gathered his reins. He was too clever to bluster and too clever to run, and he did the third thing. The cold thing, he said, gravely, that this was a most serious construction to put upon what was, he was persuaded, a matter of honest disorder in the late agent's timber accounts. That felling was a complex business, that he would of course lay every paper before his grace and any independent man his grace cared to name, and that he was confident the whole would be explained to any reasonable person's satisfaction, and he made the Duke a bow, and turned his horse, and rode down the ride at a walk, unhurried. A man with 231 stumps at his back, behaving as though he had all the time and all the right in the world, and Verity watched him go and felt no triumph at all, only the cold, because she understood what the unhurry meant. It meant he still thought he would win. It meant that counting the stumps had cost him the Duke, and he knew it, and he did not care, because the Duke was not the battlefield. Michaelmas was the battlefield. The bond was the battlefield. And Anselm Frayne rode down out of the murdered wood entirely calm, because he still held the one thing that mattered, which was the paper, the signed and sealed and lawful paper, the bond the Duke himself had signed, falling due in 3 weeks, secured on the entail, foreclosable on the day, and a wood full of stumps, and a grey book full of sums, and an old woman's contempt, and an agent's daughter's honest heart do not, on the 29th of September, redeem a bond. Money redeems a bond. And the estate had no money, because he had taken it. That is what he knew, writing down. Being found out is not the same as being beaten. He had been found out. He had not yet, by a very long way, been beaten, and there were 3 weeks to Michaelmas, and he meant to use them, and the first thing he did that very night was send word to the agent's house that the property being required for estate purposes, Miss Ashcombe would vacate it by the 25th, that being the quarter before the quarter, and the road being, as it had always been, entirely his to give. She did not vacate. The Duke, when he heard of it, rode down to the agent's house himself the next morning, alone, and stood on the worn stone step her father had hollowed with 30 years of coming and going, and told her that no one would put her out of that house while he lived, that Frayne's authority over the estate's property was suspended from that hour, and that he had written overnight to London for an independent man, a king's counsel, to come down and read her book against Frayne's before Michaelmas and tell them both whether the thing could be beaten in law and not only proved in a wood. And Verity, standing in her own doorway with the grey book locked in the room behind her, understood that the Duke had done the bravest thing a proud man can do, which is to hand his own certainty to a stranger and ask to be told the truth about it, and she thought better of him from that morning, and told him so. And he colored like a boy, which a Duke of 31 had no business doing on an agent's doorstep, and neither of them remarked on it, and both of them remembered it. The King's Council came down on the 15th of September, a dry, sceptical man named Mr. Bartholomew Quaife, who had defended and prosecuted more frauds than any man in England, and believed, on principle, nobody. And he shut himself in a room with the 2 sets of books and the grey quarto and the bundle of outside receipts for 3 days, and asked through the door only for candles and more candles. And on the third evening he came out, and he had stopped being skeptical. And he said to the Duke and the old lady and Verity together, in a voice that had lost its dryness, "In 30 years at the bar I have not seen a case of fraud so completely proved by a hand so entirely unqualified to prove it. Madam," and he bowed to Verity, a king's counsel bowing to an agent's daughter, "you have done, alone, at a kitchen table, what I should have set 3 clerks a month to do, and done it better. Because you understood the land, and they would only have understood the sums. Here is where he is beaten, and it is not the theft, though the theft is plain. It is this. Mr. Frayne was his Grace's agent, his trusted man, his fiduciary, bound in law and conscience to serve his master's interest above his own. And Mr. Frayne, in secret, through his wife's brother at the county bank, made himself his master's creditor. He arranged the very loans he then advised his Grace to sign. He stood on both sides of every bond. That, madam, is a thing no court of equity in this kingdom will enforce, because a trustee may not deal with his own trust for his own profit, and a security so procured is waste paper. The great bond that falls at Michaelmas was got by Frayne from the Duke, by Frayne's advice, into Frayne's own hand, hidden behind a bank. It cannot be foreclosed. It very likely cannot be enforced at all. And the £9,400 this young woman has traced is not a loss, it is a debt, Mr. Frayne's debt, to the estate, recoverable at law, with his own coat as security. He did not mortgage Renmore. He robbed it, and dressed the robbery as a mortgage, and this book undresses it. He is not a creditor to be paid on Michaelmas. He is a thief to be prosecuted on Michaelmas, and I should be glad to lead it. Now you would think that settled it. It did not settle it, and here is the last hard thing the stories leave out, that a king's counsel in a private room saying a thing is proved, and the world in a public room agreeing to act on it, are 2 different countries with a river between them, and the river was Michaelmas. And Anselm Frayne stood on the far bank with a signed bond in his hand, and a county that still, for the most part, thought him a respectable gentleman, wronged by a madwoman, and he had every intention of appearing at the great house on the 29th of September, all smooth grave regret, to execute his lawful security before anyone of weight had understood what the agent's girl had found, and to be gone with the deeds before the county woke up. Because possession is 9 points, and a foreclosure once entered is a hard thing to undo, and Frayne knew that if he could only get the papers signed and sealed on the day, in the ordinary way of business, the unpicking of it might take the Duke 5 years in Chancery and beggar him doing it. So the whole thing, after all the oaks and all the ledgers, came down to a single room on a single morning, and to who was in it. And Verity Ashcombe, who had learned by now how her enemy thought, made sure of the room. She did not want it done quietly in an office. She wanted it done in the open, with witnesses of weight, so that Frayne could not slide a foreclosure through in a morning and dress it afterward. So the Lady Sophronia Vane, who had not given a dinner since the old king went mad, gave one for Michaelmas at the great house, and she invited the magistrates of the division, and the rector, and the senior partner of the county bank, an upright, frightened old man named Mr. Enoch Prideaux, who knew nothing of what his junior partner had done in the bank's name, and the corn factor from Culdon, and the timber merchant, and every man of weight in 11 miles, and Mr. Anselm Frayne himself, who could not stay away without confessing by his absence, and who came, therefore, smooth and grave and certain, with the bond in his breast and his brother-in-law beside him, expecting to execute a foreclosure among sympathetic gentlemen. What he walked into was a reckoning. Because when the cloth was drawn, the Lady Sophronia Vane did not rise to toast the king. She rapped the table with an ivory fan 80 years old, and she said, "Gentlemen, I am too old for wine and too old for lies, and there has been a great one told in this county all summer, and I have asked you here to hear it undone by the person who undid it, and you will listen, because I am the oldest thing in this house, and I say you will." And she looked down the table at Verity Ashcombe in her good gray gown, with the books in front of her, and she said, "Read them the truth, child, plainly, in order, the way your father would. And let any man here who has called you mad look at your figures and call you mad to your face, if he still can." And Verity read them the truth. She stood up at a duke's table before the magistrates of the division, and she laid Anselm Frayne open like a book, plainly in order, farm by farm, and fall by fall, and bond by bond, the true rents against the rendered rents. The 400 pounds of oak against the 9,400 pounds gone. The shell of the bank, the trustee on both sides of every loan, and she did not raise her voice once, because a book does not shout. And when a man tried to break in, Frayne's brother-in-law, half up from his chair, crying that this was monstrous, that a bank's affairs were private, old Mr. Enoch Prideaux, the senior partner, who had gone grayer and grayer as she read, rose to his own feet trembling, and said the thing that was the hinge of the whole morning, the way Kello's honesty had been the hinge of another cold room in another story. "Sit down, Nathaniel," he said to his junior partner, for the brother-in-law was named Nathaniel too, and Verity felt the small cruelty of the coincidence like a splinter. Her own dead honest father's name in a thief's mouth. "Sit down, and God forgive me, for I have sat 40 years in that bank believing our name was clean, and this young woman has shown me in half an hour that you have lent this gentleman's own stolen money back to him under my roof and my signature, and I did not know it, and that is my shame for not knowing, but I know it now, and I will not have the house of Prideaux be the wall a thief hid behind. The bank repudiates the bond. The bank will not foreclose 1 foot of Renmore, and the bank will lay its own books open to Mr. Quaife tomorrow, every page, and if my partner has made me a party to a fraud, he will answer for it to me before ever he answers for it to the law." And he sat down, an old man who had lost 40 years of certainty in half an hour and chosen, in the losing, to be honest rather than safe. And Verity Ashcombe thought better of him for the rest of her life. After that it went quickly, the way a rotten wall goes quickly once the first stone is out. The corn factor from Caldon, who had grown so forgetful in August, stood up red-faced and said that he had been visited and frightened in the summer and was ashamed of it, and that Miss Ashcombe had had every receipt from his hand, and they were true. And here were the originals. And he was sorry. The magistrates, who had come to a dinner and found a trial, conferred in low voices, and then the senior of them told Anselm Frayne, in the flat voice of the bench, that he would consider himself bound over, and that a case would be laid, and that he would surrender the bond and every estate paper in his keeping that evening or be committed that night. And Anselm Frayne, who was too clever to bluster and too clever to run, and had run out at last of the third thing, sat very still for a moment among the ruins of 2 years' patient work. And then he did the only thing left to a found-out man, which was to gather what dignity a thief keeps in a drawer for emergencies, and rise and say that he would of course cooperate in the fullest clearing of what was plainly a most regrettable misunderstanding, and hand the bond across the table to the Duke with a steady hand, and walk out of Renmore into the Michaelmas dark, and be, by morning, gone from the county, and never, in fact, stand his trial, because men like Frayne feel the wind before it blows, and he was on a Dover packet before the indictment was drawn, which is the one dissatisfaction in the whole business, that he was beaten and not punished, that he kept his neck and lost only his plunder. And I will not pretend to you that he ended on a gibbet, because he did not. He ended somewhere abroad, comfortable enough on what he had salted away that even Verity's book could not trace. And that is the truth, and the stories that give you the thief in chains at the end are lying to make you feel better. But the estate was saved. That is the thing that was real. The great bond went into the fire in the Duke's own strong room that same Michaelmas night, and the 9,000 that could be traced was clawed back over the next 2 years out of Frayne's English property, and the honest old mortgage of 12,000, the one her father had known, stood as it had always stood, serviceable out of true rents by any sober man. And Renmore, which had been 3 weeks from belonging to a thief, belonged to its Duke, and the entail held. And the Oaks, well, the Oaks would take 300 years, and the Duke planted the first of the new ones himself that autumn in the West Hangar, among the stumps, so that some Duke not yet born would have a cathedral again, and had a mind, he said, to plant one for every year the theft had run, and one more for the woman who had counted the stumps. And here is the flash of it I promised you at the start. Late on that Michaelmas night, when the magistrates had gone and the old lady was carried up to bed in triumph and the house was quiet, the Duke of Renmore went down to his own strong room with a single candle, the little vault under the house where the bond had lived, and now the ashes of it lay in the grate. And he stood among the empty deed boxes he had never once had the courage to open, and he sent a servant down to the agent's house to ask, very humbly, whether Miss Ashcombe would come, because he could not make himself believe, even now, even with the thing done, how near he had come to losing everything to a man he had trusted and a truth he had turned away, and he wanted to hear it once more from the only person who had never once got it wrong. And Verity came at midnight in her cloak and stood in the little stone strong room among the empty boxes, and told him a fourth time how it had been done. Not the sums this time, but the shape of it. How a clever man had stolen an estate one honest-looking quarter day at a time, and how a book kept honest and kept long had undone him. And the Duke listened with the candle between them. And at the end he said, "In March I told you to leave the accounts to my men of business. My man of business was robbing me blind, and the accounts were a lie, and the only true account in the whole county was in the arms of a young woman I sent out into the rain. I have been a fool in every particular a man can be a fool, and you have saved my house anyway, asking me for nothing, and I find I cannot let you go home tonight without asking you for a thing that I have no right on earth to ask, and I am going to ask it badly. Here, in a strong room, at midnight, among the empty boxes of everything you saved, because I would rather ask you badly tonight and honestly than beautifully next year when the county has decided what you are." She knew what was coming. She had known, she thought, since the doorstep, since he colored like a boy. And she did the thing she had promised herself she would do if it ever came, which was to say the cost out loud before she said anything else, because she would not have him think she had not counted it. "There are people in this county," she said, "who spent all summer saying I was mad, and a great many more who will spend all winter saying I was clever, that the agent's girl cast up her figures her way into a duchess's chair, that the whole of it, my father's book, and the Oaks, and the 9,000, was only a long shrewd courtship dressed as an audit. They will say it about my father's honest name and my own, and they will say it the louder, the higher I go, and they will say it for the rest of my life. I have spent this whole summer being called mad, Your Grace, and I found I could bear it. I am telling you now, before I answer, that I have counted the cost of being called clever too, because it is the higher price, and I will not have you think I did not see the bill. I saw you read the bill, said the Duke, at my great-aunt's dinner, when your own father's name came out of that thief's brother's mouth, and I watched it go into you like a splinter, and watched you read on anyway, without a tremor. I have wanted to marry you since about the third farm. Ask me the price of it, and I will pay my half, in the open, in front of the whole county, for as long as they care to send it in. Marry me, Verity. I will spend the rest of my life being the Duke who was wrong in the library, if you will spend it being the woman who was right in the wood, and let the county make of the pair of us exactly what it likes. And Verity Ashcombe, 24, land agent's daughter, standing in a stone-strong room among the empty boxes of everything she had saved with a dead man's honest hand, found that the thing she had thought she would have to weigh for a week weighed nothing at all once it was actually in her palm, and she said, "Then I will want it written down, Your Grace, and witnessed, and proved twice, the way my father taught me, because a thing said once is only a rumor, and I have had a bellyful this year of things that were only said." They were married at Renmore Church the week before Christmas, in a hard, bright frost, and the whole county came. The ones who had called her mad, and the ones who had called her clever, and the few who had simply called her right. And the Lady Sophronia Vane came down for it in black silk, and outlived the wedding by 2 years out of what she plainly regarded as spite well spent. Old Mr. Enoch Prideaux gave the estate its honest banking for the rest of his days, and never charged the Duke a penny over the fair rate, saying he owed Renmore a clean account and meant to pay it. And Verity, who became a duchess but never stopped being an agent's daughter, asked for 3 things at her own wedding feast, and none of them were for herself. She asked that the Renmore accounts be laid open every Michaelmas in the tithe barn before any tenant who cared to come and hear them, the true rents read out in a plain voice, so that no smooth man from anywhere would ever again be able to tell a Duke a lie the whole county could have caught. She asked that the office of land agent be held, ever after, by an honest local person who knew the ground, and not by a fashionable stranger who knew only the sums, and that her father's ledgers be kept in the estate office as the pattern of how it should be done, open, for any clerk to learn from. And she asked last, and this was the one her voice was not quite steady on, that it be written down somewhere the county could read it that Thomas Ashcombe, land agent, had died an honest man slandered by a thief, and that the daughter had proved it, so that the next honest servant this house wore out in its service would know that Renmore, in the end, remembered who had told it the truth. It was all written down, in the new agent's fair round hand, and signed, and it is being read still every Michaelmas in the tithe barn, the true rents in a plain voice before the tenants, because a duchess who had once had to make her curtsy to the back of a duke's head made very sure that at Renmore, ever after, the book was read out loud. So I keep thinking about that first morning in the library, the warm fire, the 2 smiling gentlemen, and a young woman standing in the middle of a cold grand room with her dead father's book against her chest, being told to leave the accounts to the men of business while the chief man of business stood at the mantel measuring the house for himself, because that is where it ends for nearly everybody, isn't it? She had the truth in her arms in that room, and the truth was shown the door, and it did not begin to win until an old woman remembered a jointure, and a duke counted his own murdered oaks, and a banker chose shame over safety. So tell me which one you would have been, in that library or at that dinner, The one who stands up when the whole warm room has already agreed to be robbed and reads the true figures anyway? Or the one who keeps the book, quietly, for a year, in the cold, until the day it cannot be argued with? Both of them are in this story, and they are the same woman, and only one of them was ever thanked. Next time I will tell you about a governess who was handed a dead baronet's library and told to burn the papers in it, and read one of them first, and found her own married name in a will nobody knew existed. And I would dearly love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. So leave the name of your town in the comments, and I will read them out. A plain brick house at the edge of a great park. A worn stone step. A candle in the window, and on the long deal table, where a father taught his daughter to cast a column and prove it twice, a gray book open at the page where the theft stood up, and no sound in the room at all but the frost ticking in the panes, and far off, the first new oak settling its roots into the ground where the old ones were counted.